Grabación iniciada.
Okay. Hey, my computer's in Spanish, so that's why it has the funky, in case you heard that. That sounded weird to you. Okay, welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall for August 9th. And today's topic is these explain the situation type problems from critical reasoning. This is something we have had a session on before, but there were a couple of requests that we got for this sort of thing. So here was one request that we got. And there were a couple people who requested this topic, actually. But here's one example of one of those requests that we received. Find the discrepancy questions, that kind of thing. We have seen these in a previous study hall, so just so that you have reference to that, let me give you the date. We also covered these in the study hall for February 3rd of 2011. So if you want more coverage of this type of question, it's the February 3rd, 2011 study hall. But we're going to do more of this today. Basically, we had some slides that were in that study hall that we didn't get to, and so we're going to use today's study hall for those. So welcome. As usual, we have to start with rules, usual boring presentation of rules. So let's do that real quickly. What should you submit? What should you not submit? Please don't submit things that are too general. Please don't submit things that are too specific. Please don't submit personal issues. And please don't submit problems from the official guide. What you should submit is topics that are intermediate in depth, and if you submit specific questions, they should tie into more general questions. So here are some submissions from last week from this past couple of weeks that we can't use, just in case any of you guys are in the audience right now. Here are some things that people have recently submitted that are not things that we can use. One person asked, basically, how do I get better at sentence correction? This is definitely not the kind of thing that you can cover in a single session of a study hall. This is far too general for us to really make a session out of. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are questions like this one. This is a question from the, just this kind of quick question of, is it always true that in an evenly spaced set, the average is equal to the median? I mean, in case the person who submitted this is in the audience, the answer to this question is yes, but this is too specific for you to submit to the study hall. I mean, the study hall is not for things like this. For questions like this, you should use our forums, because that's the entire reason why we have a forum, is so that we can answer questions of this kind that are really specific. So nothing too general, nothing too specific. Also, don't submit your personal study plans. We didn't have as many people doing that this time, so good. I'm glad you didn't, but there you go. Also, please check the archives before you post a topic. We have about 65 sessions in the archive, so there's bound to be something related to, if you have a really general topic, it's probably in the archive somewhere. So take a look for it before you post a topic. Okay. There you go. Those are basically the rules. So please don't submit things that are too general. Please don't submit things that are too specific. Please don't submit personal study plans and so forth. No official guide problems. That's an explicit request of GMAT. And finally, please check the archive first. And if you're going to submit something we've already covered, please try to ask for some sort of angle that we haven't covered yet. So they're basically the rules. So smiley face icon, if you understand the rules. Make sure you know where the smiley face icon is. So some things are in new places here. So let me show you this. It doesn't look the same as it used to. This is the first time we're using this new Elluminate. So underneath your name, this thing should contain all the icons that used to be separately shown. Basically what I find to be the case with this new Elluminate software is it's a lot prettier, but it's a lot harder to use. Like you have to know where stuff is. And you didn't used to have to know where stuff was. Like before, everything was kind of on the screen right in front of you. And now it's not, so you have to know the locations of various things, which might get a little bit annoying. I mean, you'll get used to it, but for example, all the faces are in this little sub-menu that you get when you pull down that one face. So everybody, if you see the smiley face, go ahead and give me the smiley face, please. Okay, most of you are giving me that. Make sure you know where to find that because you're going to, on occasion I'll ask for smiley faces as responses. Okay, so most of you are finding the smiley face, so good. All right, also, let me show you where you're going to find these multiple choice A through E type answers. That's going to be here. You should see an A through E choice polling menu underneath this little thing that looks like an A. So you guys have, so far there's one answer of A and one answer of D that you guys are picking. You don't have to pick an answer right now, but that's where you get it. So when we have questions on the board, that's where you find the A through E. So if anybody can't find those things, the smiley faces and other emoticons, and then also the A through E polling choices, go ahead and shoot a message in that chat box. Otherwise, I think we're ready to go. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and fire away. If not, let's do it. Okay, so if you just arrived, the topic of today is some more of these explain the situation problems that we also saw on February 3rd. So let's take a look. Here's one of them. Should see a problem on the screen. So remember where you're going to find the polling answer buttons, the A through E type things. You're going to find those right here. Please use those to indicate your answer. Okay. Let's put a clock on the screen and take a shot at it. Okay, remember this is the GMAT. This is an exam on which you have to actually pick an answer, even if you're guessing. So there are a number of you who still don't have answers yet, so please pick something. Thanks. Okay, there's a couple of you who still don't have answers, but we're going to go ahead and move on to a discussion here. So remember, if you don't remember where the answer choices are, you can see them. Okay, now you can't. That should take care of that. Thanks, Tron. That's correct. You can't see the answers anymore, right? Okay. Somebody confirm, please. Thanks. All right. So here are your responses as a group. So, I mean, this is a pretty split group. So apparently people found this problem somewhat challenging. So let's talk generally about this kind of problem in the first place. And then we'll return to the specifics of this problem in a moment. But whenever you see this kind of thing, which of the following does the most to help explain why something? All right, let's keep it general right now. Let's see what you guys have to say. But when you see a problem that says that, what do you guys think? Like, go ahead and type in the chat box, what are some principles that you have in mind for something like this? Strengthen, is this a strengthen problem? Let's talk about that for a second. Because a lot of you guys are saying strengthen, but it's not really. Let's talk about that for a second. A bunch of you guys are saying, I mean, I'm not even talking about classifying the problem here. I mean, a bunch of you guys are coming up with classifications. It's not really where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is, let's talk about like actual things that you are supposed to do in the task at hand here. Because remember, you don't really have to classify these problems unless it helps you understand them. But it's not essential that you classify them as long as you know what you have to do. So, but a number of you guys are saying that this is a strengthen the argument problem. So, what's the biggest problem with that? It's not a strengthen the argument type of problem, because it's not even a what in the first place. Like, what do we not have here that we would have to strengthen an argument? Anybody? Yeah, we don't have a conclusion. In other words, we don't even have an argument. That's the problem. So this is not a strengthen the argument problem because there's no argument. So make sure you know what you guys are talking about before you start coming up with these classifications. And an argument is something that has a conclusion. And this passage doesn't even have one. I mean, this passage is basically just a bunch of facts. So there's no way that you're going to be able to strengthen an argument here because there isn't an argument. So, okay, it looks like people are turning on webcams or something, so let me go ahead and disable that. Okay. Yeah, there's no argument, so you can't strengthen the argument. The passage is just a bunch of facts. So, but what is it that you have to do? I mean, if you're going to put this into a category, then the category you would put this into would be basically exactly what the words say. It would be where you have to explain something, some facts that are presented. So let's talk, we'll return to that problem in a second. Let's talk about this in general. So what's the deal, basically, when you have explained the situation or paradox or discrepancy or etc.? There's a whole bunch of words you can use here, but in general, the way I like to express this is you can call these explain the weirdness problems. What are your general thoughts on what you have to do in these problems? I mean, don't give me a classification. Not the point right now. Some of you have already typed some observations here that are good. So what do you have to do? Does anybody have any other thoughts? So let me get a couple of the things that you guys have typed out of the box. And then if anyone else is typing anything, go ahead. Because of the situation thing. Okay, so let's start putting things on the board that you guys have as responses here. So here's one response that you have, and then we'll discuss these and we'll see whether they're valid or not. One word that you guys are using a lot of is prove. In fact, almost everybody wrote prove here in some sort of capacity. So let's discuss that for a second. Are you guys actually trying to prove anything? What do you guys think? Is there anything that's actually being proved? Let's talk about a simple example of this. And then let's discuss whether there really is any sort of proof thing going on here. Here's a simple example. My friend is eating more food than ever before, but he's still, nevertheless, he's still losing weight. And then let's say you were asked to explain this weird situation. So now let's talk about, first of all, before we talk in general about what's going on here, can anybody give a way in which you could explain this weird situation? Without thinking about classifying or methods or anything like that, to see if you can throw anything out there in the text box that would actually explain this situation. Yeah, so you guys are putting out a bunch of things that are valid examples. Here are a few. So the first observation is there's a whole bunch of correct answers possible. Let me change this a little bit, just because a couple of you guys are writing things like he's a growing boy or whatever. Let me make it a little bit more specific. He's still losing weight, whereas his weight, he wasn't losing weight before. So whereas his weight was previously constant for many years. So that'll get rid of some of these possible explanations. So but here are some things that are possible explanations. First is he's working out more. This is the one that was suggested most often by you guys. Another explanation is he has some disease or illness that's causing him to waste a little bit. More food, but it could be the food that he's eating is lower in calories. It could be he's taking a drug that causes weight loss, etc. So notice that these are all possible explanations here. Now, let's talk about this word prove. And then let's talk about this real quick, this last thing that was just typed into the text box. What about this? Is this a valid explanation of the weird situation here? What do you guys think of this last thing? This is kind of an interesting response. Let's talk about this. And if you type a yes or a no, then give me sort of a brief reason for why or why not. Okay, is anybody typing more? We have okay, we have a no and a yes. Interesting. The answer that you want here is this is not a valid response, because I like what, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but I like what Socket put here. You have to realize what it is that you're trying to explain. Socket, okay, good. Like an electrical socket. I bet I'm not the first person to make that joke. And I'm probably not the last. All right, anyway. This doesn't really do what you're supposed to do here. Because when we say explain the weirdness, we're not talking about external motivations behind why stuff happens. What we're trying to do here is reconcile two facts with each other. And somewhere up there, someone said this. Let me see if I can find where someone wrote that quickly. Yeah, here it is. You're trying to make two seemingly different facts go together. This is what Nancy said up there. So let me get rid of a couple of these things that say prove, because we only have to have that up there once. Let's keep those up there for discussion later. Here's what Nancy wrote a moment ago. You're trying to make two seemingly different facts reconcile with each other. This is exactly what you are trying to do. So this is the task at hand. So what this means is there's a conflict in this group of facts. Like there are two seemingly conflicting things, which are, number one, you have an increased consumption of food. And then number two, you have a weight loss. So the issue in the passage is you're trying to make these not contradict one another. So what you're doing here is, I can see where you're going with something like this, but this is not really what you're supposed to be doing, because this would be a motivation for why somebody might want to lose weight, but this has nothing to do with the problematic fact that he's eating more food. Like, in other words, this is just an external reason why someone might want to lose weight, but it doesn't have to do with the problem in this passage. The problem that you want to resolve in these things is that you have facts that seemingly conflict with each other, and you have to make those go together. Now let's talk about prove. Are you trying to actually prove something in these problems? No, you aren't. Because there's no proving. Like, these are all possible explanations. And that's all you have to come up with. You just have to come up with something that might reasonably explain. You're not trying to prove stuff because you can't. I mean, the whole point of these situations is that you don't really know what's going on, and you're trying to come up with a possible hypothesis that would explain it if it were the case. But you're basically just making up reasons why these things might be able to coexist. So this, which facts can prove it, is, I think you might be thinking in the right way, but the word prove is not the right idea. Because you're not proving things, you're just coming up with some possible explanation. This is more accurate, although there's a word that we need to throw in there to make this totally accurate, which is we have to throw the word possible in there. Because it's not the cause, it's a possible cause. And we should also get rid of the word the, because it's not the. Like, when you say that, that means there would only be one possible answer. And as you can see in this simple example to the right, there is not just one possible way. I mean, this is the problem when you have these weirdo situations, is that there's lots and lots and lots of ways in which this could be true. And so you're just looking for one of those. So you're not proving things. You're not trying to explain the things that are not weird. You're trying to explain what's weird. That's what you want to do. Why is my friend losing weight in the first place? So let's take this over to the next page and let's generalize a little bit. Here's the simple example from before. So what are you trying to do when you have these problems in general? Let's go ahead and lay out a sort of basic framework for the thinking here. So what are you doing in problems like this? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to identify what you are actually trying to explain. Because you're not, again, this is one of the biggest problems, is people don't get a handle on what they're trying to explain first. Because, like, this is an explanation of something, but it's not an explanation of the thing that we actually want an explanation of. That's the problem here. Like, this might explain why my friend would want to lose weight, but it doesn't rectify the contradiction in the passage. So, smiley face if you guys understand that this does explain something, it's just not the something that we want to explain. So, okay, smiley faces, yeah, okay, cool. So first you gotta get a handle on what it is that you want to explain. And so the functional question that you're trying to answer here is what needs to be explained. So here are a few different ways. This is the fundamental issue of all of these problems, so it's definitely important to nail this down. Here are some ways to think about this. You can think about this as what's weird, what seems to contradict what we would normally expect. What's weird? So that's what you're doing. Now, once you figure that out, let's talk about these again. These are all possible correct answers, all of these. Does anybody notice anything that all of these have in common? Sort of vague question, maybe annoyingly vague question. As far as the facts in the argument goes, what's true about these? Are these contained inside those facts or are they not? They're definitely outside the facts in the argument. They're not necessarily assumptions because, again, assumptions are things that would have to be true. And the point is that none of these things actually have to be true. Like, these could all separately explain what's going on, but none of them are assumptions. So be careful. But this is definitely outside information. And I mean, it should be clear that we need outside information, because if you think about what the situation here is, the situation is that we have a paradox, we have a discrepancy, we have a weirdness. What that means, if you have any of those things, is that it's not explained by what is there. Like, it's basically a definition of what it means for something to be weird. It means the existing facts don't explain it. So that's the next realization that you want to make here, is that you need a possible, not proved, just possible explanation that rectifies the weirdness that we're talking about, or in other words, that would help the facts agree with each other. It's not something that must be true, and so it's not an assumption. Make sure you guys know these things. It's not the same thing. It's just possible. It's just one of many possible explanations. And so there might be possible correct answers that would not look anything like other possible correct answers. Like these don't resemble each other at all. But they are all, if any of these appeared in this problem, they would all be correct answers. So, and then finally, what you need to realize is that your correct answer is going to come from outside. So, any valid explanation must come from outside the current scope of the facts in the passage. Because again, this is by definition. This is what it means for something to be weird. This is what it means for there to be a discrepancy in the first place. So just remember there's a discrepancy, which means that the explanatory idea is not going to be there. So then, smiley face if these things all make sense. Identify what you're trying to explain. What's weird, what seems to contradict what we would normally expect. And then you're looking at something that's outside the scope. I mean, yeah, Peter, the stuff does have to be there. It's up to you to figure out what the apparent contradiction is. Because let me address that real quick. That question's in the text box. Peter says, is what you are trying to explain always in the question? I mean, the simple answer to that is yes. But it also needs to be said that there is stuff in the question that you don't have to explain as well. So yes, but you have to know which part of the passage constitutes the weirdness. Like, in other words, you have to know what you're supposed to explain in the first place. So there are things like this. The reason this is not a valid response to this thing is because the issue is not why my friend would want to lose weight. That's not an apparent contradiction. You know, I mean, that could be in another circumstance. Like if you have, you know, my friend's girlfriend really wants him to gain weight, but he still wants to lose it, then this could be a valid explanation. Because you're like, I don't know why he wants to lose weight anymore. But here, that's not the point. The point here is he's eating a ton of food, but there's still weight loss, and that's what I have to explain. So the answer here is it's not going to be necessarily any particular location in the passage. It's you have to understand what's going on in response to this that we wrote up here. What's weird, what would contradict what we would normally expect. And I mean, you can find that anywhere in there. Because remember, it's not just one fact. It's the combination of more than one fact. Now, that's the other thing. It's going to be a combination of two facts that results in the weirdness. Any other questions about this, go ahead and type them in the text box. But the key step here then is this. The key step is identify what you are actually trying to explain. And that's where most trouble with this kind of stuff comes from, is people don't do that. So, like this kind of answer right here. He is preparing for a lower weight category event. This is the kind of answer that indicates that you didn't identify what you are trying to explain before you started coming up with answers. Because this is explaining something, it just isn't the right something. So let's go back to this question. And let's ask that key question that we have to ask, which is, what are we actually trying to explain? what are we actually trying to explain here? Like, there's a bunch of facts that's given here, but there's only one that is kind of an unexpected consequence given the others. Does anybody know what that is? Anybody type in the text box? Like, what particular aspect of this needs to be explained? What's weird? What do we actually have to explain? Okay, Abhishek, that's pretty much the idea. Let's see if anybody can explain it in a little bit more language-y language and less of an abbreviation type of thing. Peter, yeah. Let's see if we can put that in our own words. Try to ask this question in your own words. That's a very key thing for you to do. It shouldn't be in their words. Because if you're using their language, that's going to be very difficult to think about. It's not how our brains normally work. Like, our brains don't work in other people's words. So you don't really want to use a thing like threshold of economic viability, because who knows what the heck that even means. It's not why solar energy isn't used more, because the passage doesn't really even go there. The passage doesn't discuss how often people use solar energy. Let's pause and put the whole argument into our own words, and that'll help. So let's kill these choices real quick, and let's put this argument into our words. Very, very important to do that. Get the argument into your own words. And ideally, those words that you get that into should be as conversational as possible. They should not sound very formal, because formal language is not easy for anybody. So what this means, the first sentence means that solar power is cheaper than it used to be. That's basically what that means. So solar power is getting cheaper. I mean, solar power to electricity to use for electric is getting cheaper. Now, this is a little bit weird right here, and like this thing right here is a perfect illustration of why you have to put these things in your own words, because this is just like what in the world is going on right now. The price per barrel to which oil would have to rise in order for new solar power plants to be more economical is unchanged. What that is in my own words is how much would oil have to cost to equal out the cost of solar power. So let me write that. That's what that means. How much would oil have to cost to equal the cost of solar power? Like, what would you expect to happen to this? What would we expect? Would we expect this price per barrel to start going down or up if solar is getting cheaper? About half of you are saying up, about half of you are saying down. We would expect this to go down. Because remember that solar is getting cheaper, and this is like how much would oil have to cost to keep pace with solar. So I mean, oil would have to get cheaper also for that. That's what we would expect. So it's not what is the price of oil, it's what would oil have to cost for it to be the same. It's kind of like if gas gets cheaper and you have cars that run on gas versus cars that run on diesel. If gas gets cheaper, then the cost that diesel would have to be just as good would also get cheaper. Because, you know, otherwise gas would be better all the time. So what we would expect that the equilibrium price of oil, the just as good enough price of oil, would go down. In other words, we would expect that oil would have to become cheaper to compete effectively with solar. But that's not what the passage said. The passage says, whoa, wait a minute, that's unchanged. In other words, the passage says that oil continues to be competitive with solar at the same price. This is what we need to explain. This is the weirdness. The weirdness is this idea that oil is not getting cheaper, but nevertheless, it still is something that competes with solar power effectively. So this is what we need. So the weirdness that we have to explain here is that. So why is oil power still competitive with solar power, even though oil, even at the same price for oil? This is the real issue here. Any questions about that, go ahead and type them in the text box. But that's what is weird here. And the challenge in this problem is, of course, decoding that horrible, awful thing about price per barrel. Like, you got to ruminate on that for a little bit. The meaning of that is not obvious. That's what makes this problem very challenging, is the fact that we don't know what in the world this even means when we look at it. So that's the issue that we're trying to explain. This is a very specific issue. It's kind of like in this problem, the issue is what is causing my friend to still lose weight. And these are all things that could cause that. But you have to understand first that that is the issue. So let's take a look at this problem with answer choices. Here's the issue. Why is oil power still competitive with solar even at the same oil price? What we need something else besides oil prices. It has to be getting cheaper. Because we know that oil prices don't have to get cheaper. So, and that would mean this is the only choice that explains that. Because increased efficiency means that the oil itself doesn't have to get any cheaper because the processes that fire oil and create power are getting cheaper. So solar gets cheaper, but processing oil also gets cheaper, according to choice C. So even if oil itself doesn't get cheaper, this will still explain what is happening here. Any questions about that? Go ahead and put them in the text box. Also, any questions about the other answer choices? Feel free to put those in the text box too. I mean, very quickly, let's talk about why the other choice. I mean, the reason why all four of the other choices are wrong, in short, is that they don't address this issue. I mean, that's the simple way to express it. But more specifically, A doesn't address the issue because we don't care what has happened. This is not the issue. It's what the price of oil would have to be to compete. That's independent of what the price of oil actually is. So the actual price of oil doesn't matter in the argument. It's kind of like if I'm trying on a suit and I'm like, well, I would have to weigh about 240 pounds to wear that suit size. That statement doesn't have anything to do with how big I am now. That's how big I would have to be to wear that size. Whether I'm bigger or smaller or at that size now is relevant. B just explains what doesn't have to explain, which is the reduction in solar. Like, this doesn't explain anything about oil. This is still just talking about solar. D doesn't have to do with this stuff at all because the issue is only concerned with oil versus solar. So other things don't make a difference here. And then when the price of oil increases, well, that's not the issue either. The question is to what level. This is sort of like A. We're talking about a theoretical level that it would have to go to, versus E is saying, here's what happens if it actually goes that way. So, same problem as A. Again, make an analogy if you have to. This is kind of like saying, here's how big I would have to be to wear a size 44 jacket. A is like, I'm kind of small right now. E is like, if I gain weight, here's what happens in my life. I mean, these things don't have to do with that threshold. So, I see Trong is typing. I don't think anybody else is typing, so let's see. Well, Trong, there's nothing really that's a premise. Make sure you understand that first. Because only arguments have premises, and this is not an argument. But, so nothing is genuinely a premise here. But if you just mean the stuff in the passage, the passage doesn't explain why that. That's the whole point. It's kind of like this passage doesn't explain why my friend is losing weight, and so we have to come up with a reason why. This passage doesn't explain why oil doesn't have to change in price. We would expect that it would have to. Just like I would expect that my friend would gain weight or at least not lose it, and so I have to explain this weirdness. So what you're pointing out there is what's weird about this. Like, I would expect this threshold price of oil to go down. And it doesn't, and we don't know why. And so this is something that's random at the end of the day. But if this were true, it would totally explain it. It's kind of like these. All four of these are random. But if these are true, it would perfectly well explain what is going on here. So that's the point. Any other questions, go ahead and fire away. If not, we'll look at another one of these. Okay. I don't think anybody's typing. Let's see, one person looks like they're typing, actually. Lynn is typing something. I'm going to go ahead and throw another problem on the board so we can move on here a little bit. This problem's not easy, so if you struggle with it, it's fine. Okay. How about this? By the way, all the problems in this slide set are from GMAT Prep, official software. Okay. So here, I'm going to put a timer on the board in just a second. In the meantime, please indicate your answers with these button thingies. So remember where to find that. This is where you find your polling answers. You get used to it. Okay, here's a timer. Go for it. Okay, this problem's got a few more words than normal, so if you need to take another 30 seconds or 20 seconds or so, then go ahead and take it. But you need to answer pretty soon. Okay, there's still a couple of you who don't have answers. There's a Fang Zhang. There's a Jung In Kim. There's a Kiran. Nitha. Anybody who doesn't have an answer, please select one. And remember that where you do that is right here in this area, underneath this letter thingy here. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about it. So here are your responses as of right now. So we're kind of all over the place here. I think B and E appear to be the favorites of the crowd here, but there's nothing that's a strong majority. So looks like we've got ourselves a discussion. Well, let's talk about what's the weirdness. So let's go ahead and black out the choices real quick. And then let's discuss that. So the question here is, what are we actually trying to explain? So, and then notice one thing they do that kind of helps you out here is this time they don't just say, like, what's the discrepancy? This time they actually kind of tell you what you're supposed to explain. If they tell you, make sure you are not ignoring them. So, because here they're giving you more clueness than usual. So this time they're actually telling you what the weirdness is. So pay attention. I mean, you should still be able to figure this out without that sort of clue. Like, even if it just said, explain the discrepancy or explain the surprising result, you should still be able to do that. But if they do give you this kind of hint, you should not ignore it. So let's take a look. Who wants to try to summarize the thing we're actually trying to explain? Anybody want to take a shot at that in the text box? Yeah, Trong, basically the idea, and then there's the direction of the difference matters too. In other words, it matters that France is still the place with less heart disease. So, but remember the first step here. The first step is to put the passage itself into your own words. So at least in my own words, here's the passage. You've got two risk factors at least mentioned. There might be others, but there's two risk factors for heart disease, which are number one, saturated fat in the diet, and number two, red wine. Saturated fat, if you have more of this, you are a higher risk for heart disease. red wine, more of this, you have a lower risk of heart disease, according to the passage, whatever. I mean, it's a strange fact, but if the passage says it's a fact, then guess what? People, it's a fact. So then it says that the saturated fat factor is about the same in France and the US. So France, the French, and the Americans eat about the same amount of saturated fat. So what should you get out of that? You should get out of that the saturated fat thing is a non-issue, because that it's the same between the two countries. Right now, the French drink more red wine, and they have less heart disease. Is this weird? Yes or no? This fact. Is that weird? That is not weird, because we know that red wine lowers the risk of heart disease, so if the French are drinking more of it, this would actually make perfect sense. So that's not what we're trying to explain. But then it goes on to say, Americans have been drinking more red wine, or the French have been drinking less of it. One of those two. But the French heart disease rate is still just as much lower. It's still lower by the same amount. So that's the weirdness right there. Because what would you naturally expect to happen if this is going on? Like, if Americans are drinking more red wine, or the French have been drinking less of it, what would you expect would happen? Text box. Try to explain. I'm not really smart enough for words like convergence. Let's try to explain in words that like a fourth grader would understand. You would expect the heart disease rates to get closer together. Like, you would expect Americans to start having less heart disease, or the French would start having more. You would expect Americans to start having less heart disease, or the French to start having more. But neither of those things, as far as we know, is happening. So the weirdness that we are trying to explain is, why isn't that happening? So why aren't Americans getting less heart disease? Or why aren't the French getting more? Either one of those would explain the weirdness. So we need something that would work in one of those directions that would help explain the strangeness here. So that's what we're looking at. So if someone's mentioning exercise, that could work. That would be a correct answer if it were here, absolutely yes. Unfortunately, it's not here, but it certainly could be. And let me put that on the board. Let me also reduce the size of this thing so we can actually write up here. So what we're doing is this. This is what we're trying to explain. That's the weirdness. So what we need to explain that weirdness is we need a reason, like a different reason, why Americans would get more heart disease. Or a different reason why the French would have less. How come this changed? How come what changed? Well, when you say reported accurately, that is, let's talk about a couple of these. Okay, let me put the exercise 1 on the board. Okay, here are 2 things that people are suggesting. The first is the French have started working out more often. So this would work. If this were in the choices, this would absolutely be a correct answer. So whoever made this up, your mind is totally working the way that it should be working. Yeah. What about this? Heart disease rates are not being reported accurately in one of the countries. Well, the problem is that it doesn't say, like, reports suggest this. I mean, this actually says that there is less heart disease. There is, like, fact. And per capita of saturated fats is. So these are facts. And so this is a non-issue. Like, in other words, you can't contradict what the passage says. So if these were not being reported accurately, then one of those statements would be false, and you're not allowed to make the statements in the passage false. So you can't contradict the passage. So, like, if the passage says Ron is 5'10½", then that means Ron is 5'10½", and you can't hypothesize things like people are measuring Ron's height wrong, because if the passage says Ron is that tall, then that's what happens. That's all. Yeah. So same kind of thing here. So this wouldn't work because you're trying to say that the passage is lying, and that's not something that happens. But that thing on top could be a correct answer. So, well, let's look at these. The 2 most popular answer choices here, so the 2 that we kind of really need to talk about, are B and E, because here's what you guys picked. Someone tell me a story about choice B. Does anybody know why choice B is not right? What's wrong with choice B? What does it have to do with the weirdness? It makes the weirdness weirder. Yeah, like what Kevin says here. That's the problem with B. It goes the wrong way. Like, B makes what's weird about this passage even weirder. Because remember, what's already going on is that we would expect the French to get more or Americans to get less heart disease, but something is working against that. We're looking for something that would lower the French rate or that would raise the American rate. The problem is that B is something that would raise the French rate of heart disease. If that's going on, then that makes this whole weirdness that's going on here even weirder. So that's not what we want. So you can't just pick something that's relevant. You have to pick something that's relevant and goes the way you want it to go. Like, for instance, in this passage right here that we made up, my friend is eating more food than ever before, nonetheless he is still losing weight. That answer choice B on that problem is kind of like saying, if I said, my friend got hurt and now cannot exercise as much as he used to, then this is bad, because this would actually make this situation even stranger. I mean, this would not help explain anything. In fact, this would give us even more problematic things to explain. So, does this make sense? Like, does this make sense why this would be incorrect? This would make the weirdness even weirder. So the question here, let's go back to the passage we were looking at. This is not a contradiction. I mean, apparently, Abhishek, I think what you're asking is, I think you're trying to say that B contradicts the passage, and it doesn't. Because the passage just says that right now, these levels are about the same. So that's, B can be consistent with that. I mean, if the level in France used to be lower, then you could have B be true, and you could also have this be true. That wouldn't really be a problem. So it's not a contradiction. If you did have something that, I mean, you won't have answer choices that do that, because that's not how this works, but you won't have anything that explicitly contradicts the passage. So I hope that takes care of that question. But B is the wrong way, whereas what E does is it explains why the French are not getting more heart disease. Or, why they might have even less of it, because the decline in wine consumption is not happening among people who would get heart disease in the first place. So the passage says, overall, when you have more wine, you get less heart disease. When you have less wine, you get more heart disease. But what E is saying is that the people who are drinking much less wine now in France are really young. And that perfectly explains why the French are not getting more heart disease, because the people who will or should are not old enough yet. So meaning that we're probably going to observe the effect that we want to observe in another generation or so. But right now, the people among whom we expect to observe an increase in heart disease are still too young to show that increase. So, okay, if anybody has any questions about that. But notice that what's the challenge here is not really using the answer choices. The challenge is this whole idea that we have to figure out what we're trying to do in the first place. We have to actually nail down the thing that we're trying to explain. Any questions about this? Go ahead and fire away. If not, we will look at another problem. Okay. Right now, okay, one person is typing. Let's see. Pull up another problem while you guys are typing. How many minutes can we spend on this kind of problem? It depends on how long it is. Like the average time that people spend on these kinds of problems is usually something like a minute 45 to 2 minutes, maybe a minute and a half to 2 minutes, but it depends on how long the problem is. It depends on how much stuff is in the problem. So if there's more words in the problem, then you can spend a little longer. If there's fewer words, you can spend less time, most likely. Trong, I don't understand what you're asking. Is it less consumption? Right? I don't know what it means in this question. So maybe you could clarify. Well, it's less consumption of red wine is what creates the discrepancy in the first place, right? Like, this is what they say. They say that the red wine consumption has been approaching American levels. So that's why there is a weirdness in the first place. But then that weirdness is explained by the fact that those people are young. So, I mean, I don't know if it's a simple yes or no answer to your question, but one of those things is the reason why we even have to explain anything. And then the other part of it is what actually does the explaining. Okay. Let's look at another one. How about, let's say this one right here. This one's shorter than the others, which means that on average you should be spending less time on this. Ed, these are like explain the weirdness, or explain the discrepancy, or explain the situation, or explain the whatever. Explain the something that needs explaining type of question. Okay, here's a timer for you guys. There's a precision chronometer for you. Remember where to indicate your answers, please, ladies and gentlemen. The answers are underneath this little menu. Go for it. Okay, go ahead and pick something if you don't have something. This one, it appears to be not as hard for you guys as the other ones. So that's good, right? But go ahead and pick an answer if you don't have one yet, please. Okay, let's move on. If we make this sort of quick, we can probably get another problem in. Here you guys have a solid majority. That black bar there is people who didn't answer the problem. So, I mean, remember, you got to answer these things. Don't forget that. So if you didn't answer the problem, you got to answer the problem. But among the people who did, it's almost unanimous. So let's make this sort of quick. Remember what it is that you're trying to do. You're trying to say, what are we actually trying to explain in the problem? Like, what's the weirdness in the problem? So let's make this fast because a lot of you guys got this. But what's the weirdness? Well, small businesses would be exempt from paying a minimum wage. So theoretically, they should not care about this. Like, the law would raise the minimum wage. It's not that it would benefit them, it's just that, I mean, at least not directly. It's just that they shouldn't really care one way or the other. They're exempt from the law. That means the law doesn't affect them at all. So the law would raise the minimum wage, but not for small businesses. Therefore, we would expect that small businesses would not care because it doesn't really change the way they operate. So the weirdness then is, why would small businesses care? So you need a reason why this. In other words, you can ask a very different. You can ask a different version of the same question, which is like, the law doesn't include small businesses, but if they care that much, there must be some effect on them. So how does the law affect small businesses, even if they are technically exempt from it? So yeah, why, Prashant, exactly, why does it hurt them even if they are technically excluded from it? So this choice does a very good job of explaining that, this choice B. They have to match the wages offered by competitors. So even though the small businesses are technically exempt, this choice would mean that the small businesses' wages would be tied to larger businesses' wages. So then, in effect, that choice B would mean the law still has just as much of an effect on them, even if they're technically exempt from it. Under the current law, we don't care because we're only discussing the effect of the potential new future law, and nobody picked that. The number of companies, we don't care because we're just talking about what is going on if you are one of the companies that are exempt. It doesn't matter how many of those companies there are. We're just saying, what situation do you face if you are one of them? Some states do this, but that doesn't affect the federal legislation. I mean, some states do this, some don't. Great, but that doesn't tell us why the small businesses would feel this way about the federal issue. And then it doesn't really matter what industry service companies are in, what industry small businesses are in. And employees per dollar is not the issue. It's how much do they have to pay their employees in the first place. So, but this is the one, if you identify that this is the thing you're trying to explain, then you can nail this one. Let's see if we can knock out one more before we have to leave here, and that's this one. So try this. Let me put a timer on the screen. Here's your precision chronometer. Again, remember where your answer choices are located. Your answer choices are located right there. Have a good time. But why is Balzania funny? So, you're going to start with balls? Gotcha. Thought there might have been a more pop culture reason for that. All right, Balzania. Let's talk about it. If you don't have an answer yet, please pick one. Okay, we got still a couple of you don't have an answer. There's a Steven number 2. There's a Tsunya. There's Manish, Neetha, Fang. If you are one of these people, Kristen, Kieran, Kyle P., pick an answer, please. If you are one of these people. Okay. All right, let's take a look I'm going to keep this quick because we're technically out of time here, so let's talk about the weirdness. Here are your answers as a class. So there's a majority, it's not a majority, I guess, but there's a most popular choice, which is choice C, and then it kind of goes down from there. But let's talk about what it is that we're trying to explain in the first place. So Balzania has these regulations that require people who have mines to pay to reclaim the land. Even if you don't really know what reclamation means, you can kind of figure it out. Because, I mean, you have land that's been mined out, and what do you want to do with it? So even if you don't know this word, you can kind of figure out that it means, like, making the land normal again as much as possible. So you know what land looks like when you mine it. It's horrible. So reclamation is like making the land less awful after you have a mine there. So the technology is the same, but the cost per mine is way less than it used to be. So in my own words, here's how the argument works. The technology for repairing the land has stayed the same. So there's no cost change there. And in fact, you would expect that might cost a little bit more because of inflation that, you know, happens over a period of 20 years. So therefore, we would expect, what would we expect? We would expect the cost of repairing the land, everything else equal, we would expect it to either remain the same, not counting inflation, or in fact, if you do take inflation into account, it would be expected to increase. So that's what we would expect. Does anybody know why they're talking about dollars per ton of coal? Like, why are they doing that? Does anybody have an explanation for why it's dollars per ton of coal? Yeah, it's because the mines aren't all the same size. Like if you had dollars per mine, it would obviously matter how big the mines are. So this is like same reason why you have like crime rates per capita and not like overall crime rate. The overall crime rate would just depend on how big a city was, but a crime rate per capita doesn't. So like it sounds like a weird statistic, but dollars per ton of coal means that the size of the mines is no longer an issue. Like if it were dollars per mine, then you could explain the effect by saying maybe mines got smaller. So, but that's not a valid response anymore because it's dollars. It's repair cost per amount of coal. So it's basically repair cost per unit. So the existing mines are extracting more coal, yeah, but then that wouldn't explain why repair costs are less. So Prashant, if you say that, then you're getting away from the issue. That's why it's so important to identify what the issue is first. So the issue is just that we would expect repairing the land to get the same or more expensive, and it became less expensive. So, but repairing the land has become, as less than half as expensive as it was 20 years ago. So this is what we need. What we need is a reason why has repairing the land become less expensive. That's the weirdness. So this is the thing that we have to explain. We have to explain that. And remember, what you're not allowed to have as an explanation is technology, because they explicitly come out and say that that's a non-issue. So, because that technology is constant. The technology is not any better. So we need a way, what we need here is something very precise. We need a reason unrelated to technological improvement why reclaiming mines has become much, much cheaper. So, and it also can't have anything to do with the mines being smaller, because this takes care of that. So the mines continue to be less expensive to operate. Operating costs don't have anything to do with this, because as long as the mines are operating, then there's no reclamation. Reclamation is you're done doing that mine and you have to fix the land. So this consideration is a thing that you have to talk about if you were a miner, but it doesn't have anything to do with this issue. Because reclamation is after the mines cease to operate. Choice B, the use of coal as a fuel has declined. That doesn't matter because we don't care. Like, nothing to do with the cost of fixing the land. It's kind of like if I put a baseball through a window and it doesn't cost as much to fix the window as it used to. You can't say like, oh, people don't play baseball as much. I mean, you can say that, but we don't care because we're talking about fixing windows. And again, making analogies like that can definitely help. You see why answers don't work or do work or don't work. They have ceased surface mounting in the mountainous areas because reclamation costs are particularly high. So what this says is that they recently, the mines that have been operating have been not in the worst possible land. So there haven't been mines of the type that are most expensive to reclaim. In other words, the mines that are there now are cheaper to reclaim. This is the correct answer. This is kind of like saying that the cost of the average cost of, I don't know, a leather jacket is less than it used to be. And this is kind of like saying that the most expensive Italian brands are no longer made. That would perfectly explain it, because what you have left is the stuff that's cheaper. So, same sort of thing. D doesn't matter. Production of coal doesn't make any difference. It's kind of like A. A is just talking about like the actual operations of mines. So is D. This is a choice about actual mining operations, but we're talking about the cost of cleaning up after the mine is finished working. So, and then a greater percentage, same problem as A. Like A, D, and E are all about what goes on with mining right now, which doesn't affect the cleanup cost. Like we're talking about after the mines are out of operation. How much does it cost to fix the damage? So these are not legit. That leaves us with C. So let's close with a couple of comments about what you can do. Here are two suggestions for how to get more mileage out of these kinds of problems with explain the weirdness problems. The first is make your own alternative correct answers. Because remember that there should be lots of ways to explain whatever weirdness exists in the problem. So for example, in this problem about red wine that we had, one person in the class suggested this. This is a good way to start getting your mind working in the right way. Start making other answers that are not there, but that would be correct if they were. I remember that passage about my friend losing weight. We came up with like 4 or 5 ways to explain that. So this is a good way to get the brain cells working, is to come up with your own correct answers. And then also, number 2, you can also make an analogy for the passage. In other words, meaning you have the same type of logic or relationships, but different subject matter. So that's kind of like this last argument where this is like mines cost less to reclaim on average, and this is like the most expensive mines haven't been doing this lately. My analogy was leather jackets cost less on average, and this is the brands that made the most expensive leather jackets aren't making them anymore. Same sort of thing. It's very different subject material, but the logic is the same. For answer C, do we really care why the mining has ceased? No, we don't, because we're just talking about how much it costs to... We don't care why the party ended. We just care how much it costs to clean up the party the next morning. You know, we don't care who broke it up. We just care how much it costs to clean up all the broken glass, kind of thing. Yeah, labor costs going down, Abhishek, that could work as well. This is a good alternative correct answer. If it were there, because the technology is not any better, but I mean, this is probably a little bit far-fetched, but it would be some sort of contributor. But remember, this is a gigantic decrease. I mean, this is like a more than 50% decrease. And if you think about reclaiming a mine, that's probably more of a technology thing than a labor thing, because you can't reclaim a mine with, you know, people with shovels and stuff. But yeah. Prashant, I'm not really sure where you're going with that, because there is a timeline in the question, and it's the same timeline. It's right there. The question is explicitly comparing 20 years ago with now. So immediately after regulations took effect was 20 years ago, and now is now. It depends if that matters or not. Like, you really can't give a straight up answer to that. You have to think about whether that could have an effect. I mean, you definitely cannot just eliminate answers if they are things that we didn't mention. Like that's all kinds of problems. Because remember, the fundamental aspect of what happens in these problems is that the correct answer is something that's not there. Like, think about all of these. I mean, we didn't talk about working out, we didn't talk about diseases, we didn't talk about calories, we didn't talk about drugs, and that's the point. The point is we didn't talk about those things, and they might matter. So that's actually the entire point of these problems, is what could go on outside these statements that could explain them. So if you're just looking for things that are in the passage, then you're going to be in trouble, because the whole point here is that the correct answer is not there. Just be aware of that. So here are two suggestions. We've seen a couple examples of each of these in the study hall. We got to close up shop here pretty soon, because we're over time here by about 15 minutes at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. If you have administrative questions, very quickly go ahead and ask those. This is not the time for submitting topics or for asking any sort of GMAT question. But if you have any admin type of questions or business questions, feel free. And if not, you can just quit. There's no log out, there's nothing like that. You just quit the program. Thanks for coming. Good night and good luck.